It was a Tuesday night in March. Rain coming sideways across West Texas the way it does when the sky means business. My phone buzzed once. A neighbor I barely knew. 8 words that changed everything. Your grandfather is sitting on the porch. Bags and all. I was 40 minutes away. I drove it in 30. And when I pulled up, there he was. 80 years old. Soaking wet. Clutching one thing against his chest like a child holds something precious in the dark. An old weather radio. He'd sold his ranch 8 months earlier for $1.2 million. He handed every single cent to my father. He asked for only 3 words in return. Take care of me. What happened in a lawyer's conference room 3 months after he was gone, after a folder was opened that nobody in that room ever expected, is the kind of moment that makes everything go completely silent. Before this story goes any further, hit subscribe and give this a like. Because stories like this one, about a quiet man who kept his promise in writing long after anyone expected him to, deserve to travel as far as they can go. His name was Harold. Harold Anderson. 80 years old. 51 years on a ranch in West Texas that the rest of the county considered unremarkable dirt. He patched his work boots with shoe glue until the soles were more rubber than leather. He drank his coffee from one chipped blue enamel mug, the same one for as long as anyone could remember, and he washed it by hand every single time. When the truck's air conditioning broke, he rolled the windows down for 3 full summers and called it fine. To his family, Harold was a man of land and very little else. To Harold, that description was almost exactly right. My name is Faye. I was 33 that spring. Freshly humbled, if I'm honest. I'd spent 4 years building a soil sensor startup for farmland, cheap probes, a little weather model, software that told farmers when to water and when to wait, and it had collapsed the year before. Not with a bang. With a slow, quiet financial bleed that ended with me doing contract coding in a 1-bedroom apartment and pretending I had a plan. So when my grandfather called his remaining family to the kitchen table and slid $1.2 million across it, I was the one with the least to say. He sat across from my father Roy, hands folded over that old weather radio like it was something sacred. My mother Linda stood behind Roy with her arms crossed, nodding in that careful way of hers, like she'd been involved in negotiating something she actually had no part in building. My father kept saying, "Dad, you don't have to do this." And Harold, who never once wasted a syllable on ceremony, looked at his son and said 3 words. Take care of me. That was the arrangement. No contract. No attorney present. No written agreement of any kind. Just a handshake and a promise and a wire transfer that cleared by Monday morning. I asked him afterward, just the 2 of us, why he hadn't put it in writing. He smiled at me. The slow one. The one he saved for when he thought you were almost asking the right question. Some things you write down, Faye, he said. Some things you find out. I thought it was old man wisdom. The kind that sounds profound and means he didn't want to deal with a lawyer. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything that year. He folded his hands over the radio, slid that small brass key back under his collar, a key on a worn leather cord he wore everywhere, even to the dinner table, and said nothing else. The check cleared by Monday. For about a month after he moved into my parents' house, everything looked fine from the outside. Then the phone calls started. My mother would call with her voice arranged carefully into worry. Faye, has your grandfather said anything to you about us? About the house? I'd say no, because he hadn't. She'd go quiet for a beat too long. Well, she'd say, he gets confused sometimes. We just want to manage things properly. I didn't have a word for it then. I do now. It's the oldest move in the book. You keep the wrong relative in the dark. You whisper about confusion and management. You make yourself the responsible one in every conversation except the ones that matter. My mother was very good at it. She'd grown up with nothing and married into a ranching family that never made her feel like she belonged. 30 years of feeling quietly poor in a house that sat on land. When $1.2 million landed in Roy's checking account, something in her decided it was finally, at long last, hers. I didn't see the danger in those phone calls. I told myself my parents were tired. I told myself caring for an aging man was just hard. I told myself that for weeks. Right up until the night the bags went out on the porch. The rain came sideways that Tuesday. It didn't ask permission. When I pulled up to my parents' house, Harold was on the front steps under the porch light. 2 canvas bags beside him, already soaked through. That weather radio pressed against his chest. The antenna up. The little speaker crackling out a storm advisory that nobody needed, because the storm was already there. The porch light was on. The house lights were off. They had put him out and gone to bed. My father opened the door before I could knock, like he'd been rehearsing his explanation. "Faye, it's not what it looks like. There's a wait list at Sage Meadows, we're just..." My mother appeared behind him in her robe. "We moved him to the curb so the transport van could find him easily," she said. "In a thunderstorm. At 10 at night." I asked how long he'd been outside. Roy looked at the floor. Linda lifted her chin. "He's not our problem anymore," she said. "We did our part." I stopped talking. There was nothing left to say to them. I went back down the wet steps, crouched in front of my grandfather, and put my hand on the cold plastic of his radio. "Hey," I said. "Let's get you out of here." He looked at me. And for a man his family had spent weeks calling confused, his eyes were perfectly steady. "Take care of me," he said. Quiet. Not a plea. More like he was handing something off. I got his bags. I got him into the truck. As I buckled him in, the porch light behind us went dark. We drove away in the rain, the radio crackling between us. My apartment was 800 square feet. Not designed for 2 people. Not designed for a man with a cardiologist and a blood pressure schedule and a stomach that didn't like half the things I kept in the fridge. I gave him the bedroom. I took the pull-out couch. That first night, I peeled wet clothes off an 80-year-old man, found him one of my old company t-shirts, and set him up with extra blankets while the radiator made its complaints. He didn't say a word about the couch or the cramped kitchen or the laptop cables running across the floor. Harold never complained. Not once in his life, as far as I could tell. He just sat on the edge of my bed at midnight, carefully drying that battered radio with a dish towel, checking that it still worked. It still worked. By the second morning, I had built my entire life around him. Spreadsheet with his medications. Blood pressure log. Cardiology appointment dates. Foods that didn't start a war with his stomach. I moved my contract calls to early mornings so my afternoons were free. I told myself it was temporary. Just until things settled. Just until my parents came to their senses. They didn't call. My brother Dale did. His text came in on day 3. "Don't make this a thing, Faye. Mom and Dad had reasons. He's a lot to handle. He's a lot to handle. 150 pounds. Asked for nothing. Washed his own dishes." I didn't write back. I just looked at the line of light under the bedroom door and listened to the low static of the radio he kept on all night so the apartment wouldn't feel so quiet. I had no idea how I'd afford the cardiologist on contract income. I had no idea how long temporary was going to be. What I knew was simpler than a plan. I was not sending him back. My mother called once that month. Not to ask how Harold was doing. To ask whether he'd mentioned the ranch money. I told her he was sleeping and hung up. Then I sat on my pull-out couch and did the math on a prescription copay I couldn't cover. And I laughed, because the alternative was falling apart in front of a man who was already carrying enough. A week later, I swallowed every piece of pride I had left and called my parents to ask, plainly, without drama, just numbers, if they would split the cost of a prescription adjustment his cardiologist had ordered. The dose had changed. The price had jumped to $240. I'd just lost a contract. My mother answered on the 4th ring. I explained it flat. There was a pause on the line. Then she said it in a tone so reasonable it took me a second to feel the blade. "We took care of him, Faye. The check cleared. We did our part. We got the responsibility. It's done. Here's your project now." Your project. As though a person were a side task you picked up between meetings. I didn't argue. Arguing with my mother was like wrestling smoke. You ended up tired and dirty and holding nothing. I just said okay. And hung up. And stood in my kitchen for a minute. And that's when the whole shape of it finally clicked into place. To my parents, that $1.2 million was never a care arrangement. It was a buyout. They'd cashed the check and considered the account closed. Harold had asked them to take care of him. They had decided the check itself counted as the answer. In their ledger, the books were balanced. I went to check on him. He was awake, propped up on the pillow, the radio murmuring. "You okay, kid?" he asked. Because somehow he was the one checking on me. "Never better," I said. He didn't believe me, but he let me have it. What I didn't expect was that he would start trying to fix my life while I was busy fixing his. It started slowly. He'd watch me hunched over my laptop at the kitchen table, debugging someone else's broken inventory software for $90 an hour, and he'd ask, quietly, "What happened to your own thing?" My own thing. The soil sensor startup. Cheap probes and a weather model that told farmers when to water and when to wait. A real product. It had died for lack of money before the market noticed it existed. "It's gone," I told him. "Too expensive to build. Nobody would pay the right price." He picked up his chipped blue mug, the one I'd packed from his ranch kitchen without asking, and turned it in his hands. "Good tools earn their keep," he said. "So make a cheaper tool." I told him it wasn't that simple. "Most things people call complicated," he said, "are just expensive. And most expensive things are just refusing to start over." Then he started asking real questions. How does the probe read moisture? What's the weakest component? Why does a rain sensor cost more than rain itself? By the end of the week, we had a notebook full of his blocky pencil sketches. A man who had read the sky for 51 years, redesigning my hardware around the one instrument he'd always trusted, that beat-up weather radio. "The storm data is on the public band," he said, tapping it. "Why are you paying for satellite?" He was right. I'd been paying for satellite data. That was the first afternoon in a year I worked on my own idea instead of someone else's problem. And somewhere around 4 o'clock I noticed I'd forgotten to be sad. He noticed too. He didn't say anything. He just refilled his mug. He started getting tired in the 3rd month, the way that doesn't announce itself. He slept later. He'd nod off mid-sketch, pencil still in hand. The chipped blue mug would sit on the table going cold, half full. That last part frightened me more than anything else. Harold Anderson had never in his life let a cup of coffee go to waste. I picked up 2 more contracts to cover the medical visits. I ran on 5 hours of sleep. I got short with a client and lost that contract too. I told no one. Because there was no one to tell. I had built my whole identity around being the person who handles it. And handling it alone had become its own kind of stubborn pride. I wouldn't ask my aunts. I wouldn't ask Dale. I wouldn't have asked my own reflection for a glass of water. So I just absorbed it. All of it. Until my hands shook a little in the mornings. One afternoon, Harold watched me count his pills into the organizer with my jaw set tight, and he reached over and stopped my hand. "You're doing the thing," he said. "What thing?" "The thing where you carry it so nobody sees the carrying." I told him I was fine. He gave me that slow smile. "So am I," he said. Which we both knew was a lie. And somehow that made it easier. 2 people at a kitchen table, refusing to fall apart together. I found the envelope while refilling his medications. He'd asked me to load his pill organizer from the bag in the nightstand. When I pulled the bag out, something slid free and landed on the floor. A sealed envelope, the heavy cream kind, with a printed appointment card paperclip to the front. The embossed name in the corner read, Margaret Ellison, Attorney at Law. Estate and Trust. The appointment card had a date. 11 days out. 11 in the morning. Below it, in handwriting that wasn't his, a single note, "Bring the key." I sat back on my heels and held it in both hands. I did not open it. I want you to understand that. A man who had given away $1.2 million and been put out in the rain, and his granddaughter, broke and exhausted, found a sealed envelope from an estate attorney and simply put it back. It didn't even tempt me. Some doors, a person opens himself. I slid it back exactly where it had been. And when I looked up, he was watching me from the bed. He'd been awake the whole time. His hand moved to his collar, closed around the brass key. "You'll drive me Thursday," he said. Not a question. I said I would. I didn't ask what was in the envelope. I didn't ask what the key opened. I just memorized the date, the name, and the address, and kept them like a stone in a pocket for everything that came after. Thursday, I drove him to a low brick office building with Margaret Allison's name on a brass plate by the door. He dressed for it. Pressed shirt. Good boots. He took the brass key off from around his neck in the truck and held it in his closed fist the whole walk in. I offered to come back for him. Sit, he said. So I sat in the waiting room with a styrofoam cup of terrible coffee and watched the minutes move. 53 of them. When the door opened, he came out steadier than he'd gone in. The way a man walks when he's set down something he's been carrying a long time. The attorney walked him out. Margaret Allison. Mid-50s. Reading glasses pushed up into iron gray hair. A handshake like she meant it. She looked at me a beat longer than a stranger should. "You're Faye," she said. It wasn't a guess. She told my grandfather she'd take care of the rest. In the truck, he buckled himself in and looked out at the parking lot for a long moment. "I fixed something I should have fixed years ago," he said. I asked what. He turned the brass key over in his fingers. Slipped it back under his collar. "You'll find out," he said. Same as always. I wanted to push him. Ask about the envelope, the key, what he'd fixed, why now. But he had his eyes closed and his face tipped toward the sun coming through the windshield, and he looked for the first time in months like a man at peace. So I let him have the quiet. And I drove us home. My brother Dale showed up the following weekend with a gas station bouquet, a rehearsed smile, and the transparent energy of a man who has done arithmetic on a dying relative. He sat with Harold for 10 minutes, mostly talking about himself, then found me in the kitchen. "So how's he doing?" "Really?" Really meant financially. I could hear it in the pause before the word. I said he was tired. Dale lowered his voice. "Listen. Somebody should have power of attorney for his protection. Keep it in the family. Me, Mom, and Dad. Keep it simple." I told him Harold managed himself fine. Dale's smile went thin. "Faye, there's stuff you don't know about. Assets nobody's tracking. If he goes without this sorted, it's a mess for everyone." I asked what assets. He caught himself. Waved it off. "The ranch money," he said. "Mom and Dad's money." But the word had already landed. Assets. Plural. Like there was something beyond the 1.2 million no one had mentioned. I filed it next to the other stone in my pocket. After Dale left, I checked on Harold. He'd heard every word through the thin wall. "Your brother wants my signature," he said. I told him nobody was getting anything he didn't want to give. He chuckled, low and dry. "Oh, they'll get a signature. Just not the one they're after." I asked what that meant. He patted the radio on the nightstand. "Turn this up, would you? There's weather coming." And there was. 3 days out on the long-range band, the first spring storms building up from the Gulf. By the time those storms arrived, everything had already changed. The last fully good night we had was a Sunday. He felt strong. He ate a real dinner. He sat at the kitchen table while I soldered a new prototype component, the radio playing a baseball game low in the background. He watched my hands work for a while. Then he said the thing. "You never once asked what was in it for you," he said. I looked up. He was turning his mug slowly on the table. "Your parents, the day of the wire. Your brother last weekend." First question out of all of them was the same one. "What do I get? You've had me 3 months. You sold your car. You haven't asked once." I told him there was nothing to ask. He shook his head. "That's the whole thing, Faye. That's the entire thing." I didn't know what to say. So I said the true thing. The small one. "I didn't take you in for a reason," I told him. "I took you in because it was you." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he flipped my own grandfather's words back at me. The 3 words he'd said across a kitchen table to a son who hadn't earned them. "You did take care of me," he said. Past tense. Like closing a book he'd been reading a long time. I made some joke about how the job wasn't finished yet. He let me have it. But something had settled in him. A stillness I mistook for peace. I only understood later what it really was. A man arriving somewhere he'd been walking toward for a long time. He went to bed early. I tucked the blanket, turned the radio down but not off, the way he liked. At the door, he said, "Good night, kid." I said, "Good night, Grandpa." Those were the last ordinary words we ever traded. He might have known that. I didn't. He didn't wake up on Wednesday morning. I knew before I touched the door handle. The way you know a house has gone empty the moment you step inside. He'd gone in his sleep. Sometime in the small hours. The radio still murmuring on the nightstand. And the chipped blue mug, rinsed, upside down, on the drying rack. He had washed his own mug. 80 years old. 3 months from a porch in a rainstorm. And the last thing he did before he went to sleep for the last time was rinse his cup so I wouldn't have to. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. The radio kept talking. A calm voice reading out a marine forecast for a coast 400 miles away, for boats neither of us would ever own. At some point I reached over and turned it off. The apartment got so quiet I couldn't stand it. So I turned it back on. Then I made the calls. And because it was the decent thing, even when decency hadn't been earned, I called my parents. My mother picked up. "Mom," I said. "Grandpa passed last night." Silence on the line. And then, I will hear this for the rest of my life. The first thing out of her mouth was not a sound of grief. It was a question. Quick and bright and reaching. Oh, Faye, has anyone called the lawyer?" Her father was 4 hours gone. And her first instinct was the estate. I told her I had to go and hung up. I made myself a cup of coffee in his mug. And I let it go cold. Just to know how it felt. The funeral was where my mother gave the performance of her life. She wore charcoal gray. She wept precisely. She accepted the arms of cousins who held her and believed everything she said, because she'd had 30 years to become the sympathetic one in every room she entered. "We took such good care of him," she told the receiving line, again and again. "We did everything we could. At the end, he just wanted to be near family." People nodded. People held her hands. I stood off to one side in a black dress I'd bought for a startup pitch I never gave. And I said nothing. Because there is no winning a grief contest against someone willing to perform grief at their own crime. Dale gave a eulogy about the value of hard work that was somehow mostly about Dale. My father said nothing. He sat in the front pew with his hands between his knees, eyes on the floor. Twice I watched him glance at the casket and look away fast, like it hurt to be caught looking. That was the first crack I noticed in Roy Anderson. I kept it. After the service, as the crowd thinned, a woman in iron gray hair came up the aisle toward me. Navy suit. Leather folder under her arm. "Margaretta, listen." She offered her condolences, plain and real. Then she handed me a card with a date and time on the back. "The reading of the will," she said. 10 days out. My office. She held my eyes. "Your grandfather asked that everyone be in the room." Everyone. Then she did something I've thought about many times since. She glanced once at my mother across the chapel, looked back at me, and gave a single small nod. The kind that says, "I know something you don't yet." The 10 days before the reading were their own kind of slow weather. My mother's story hardened into family fact. Faye took advantage of a sick old man. Faye isolated him. Faye is after the estate. The irony of that last one, coming from the woman whose first question over her father's body was about the lawyer, could have powered a small city. The cousins took sides. Aunt Carol called to suggest, gently, that maybe I should let the family handle the estate and not make a scene. A scene. I had made a casserole every night for 3 months. I had sold my car to cover prescriptions. I had built a working prototype on a pull-out couch. My mother stood in a chapel and that was grief. I existed and that was a scene. I told Carol, "I'm not going to argue about a man I actually showed up for." And hung up before she could make it about me making it a scene. In the quiet apartment, I kept his radio on. I kept the brass key, because 3 days after the funeral, sorting the last of his things, I'd found it lying loose in the nightstand drawer. Not on its leather cord. Just resting on top of a folded slip of paper in his blocky pencil hand. "Give this to Margaret." So I would. The morning of the reading, I did something that probably sounds strange. I put his weather radio on the passenger seat of the truck and buckled it in. I know how that reads. I'm an engineer. I don't believe a radio carries a soul. But I had driven him to that lawyer's office once already with that thing crackling between us. And I was not about to do the last drive with the seat empty. The radio read out a severe thunderstorm watch for the whole county. The storm we'd been tracking for days, finally arriving. The brass key was in my coat pocket, wrapped in his pencil note. I parked outside Margaret Allison's building as the first heavy drops hit the windshield. My parents' Bic was already there. So was Dale's truck, the one he couldn't afford. I sat for one moment with my hand on the radio's warm plastic case. Whatever's in there, I told it, like a person with good sense would never do. We did our part. Then I turned it off and went inside to learn what my grandfather had spent his last clear afternoon putting into writing. The waiting room smelled like rain and toner. My mother sat with her ankles crossed and her chin up, already wearing the face of a woman about to be vindicated. Dale bounced his knee. Roy sat slightly apart, staring at the carpet. When I walked in, my father looked up at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between dread and apology, and then looked away. My mother leaned toward Roy and said it just loud enough for the room. Well, there's not much to read, is there? The man gave it all away to us. Dale snorted. Probably just the truck and that junk radio, he said, and glanced at me because he'd seen me carry it in. Let me tell you what they believed walking into that conference room, because it matters for what happened. They believed the $1.2 million had been the whole of Harold Anderson. They believed they already had the money. Free and clear. The account settled. They believed today was a formality. A short reading of a frugal old rancher's odds and ends. The only open question, in their minds, was whether I'd try to grab the mug for sentiment. They had absolutely no idea. They had spent 30 years standing on top of something and calling it dirt. Margaret Allison stood in the doorway of the conference room and looked at each of us one by one. Harold updated everything, she said, 8 weeks ago. The whole room stilled. 8 weeks ago. After the rain. After the porch. After he moved into 800 square feet and started sketching senses in pencil and asking about who keeps things in writing. My mother's smile flickered. We filed in. Rain hit the windows hard. A long conference table. A gray metal lockbox sitting on the credenza at the far wall. Small keyhole. I felt the brass key in my pocket go heavy. Margaret set down her leather folder. Beside it, she placed a long accordion file on the table. On the tab, in blocky pencil letters, the land. She looked around the table over her reading glasses. Before I read the document, she said, your grandfather left an instruction. She slid a folded note across to me. His pencil. Short. Faye. Open it when she asks. The key is yours. I stood. I walked to the credenza. With every eye in that room on my back, I took out the brass key on its worn leather cord and fit it into the lock. It turned like it had been waiting 51 years. Inside the lockbox was a single accordion file. The land. I carried it to the table and set it down. My mother's voice came out thin. What is that? Margaret opened the file, put on her glasses, and looked at the room. This, she said, is what Harold Anderson actually owned. And the temperature in that conference room changed before she read a single number. She read it plainly. No theater. Which somehow made it worse. In 1979, she said, Harold Anderson had severed the mineral estate from the surface of his ranch. He signed a mineral lease the rest of the county considered worthless. Everyone in town said Harold was a fool. Nothing was down there. They were wrong. For 4 to 6 years, those minerals had produced. Slowly at first. Then steadily. Then, after new wells came in across the basin, substantially. Harold had never spent a dollar of it. He'd let it accumulate, in accounts, in conservative holdings, managed alone, in silence, telling no one, while he patched his boots and rolled his windows down and drank from a chipped blue mug. When he sold the surface of the ranch the year before, Margaret said, he sold only the dirt. He kept what was underneath. She turned the financial statement around so the table could read the number at the bottom. The mineral estate and its accumulated value, as of 8 weeks ago, the same 8 weeks my mother had called managing things, was valued at just over $20 million. $20 million. The number sat in the middle of the table like a stone dropped through glass. Dale made a sound like the air had left him. My mother said that's impossible in a voice that had lost every bit of its certainty. Aunt Carol's hand went to her mouth. And my father? My father didn't look at the statement at all. He was looking at the accordion file. At the words "the land" in his own father's pencil. And his face had gone the gray of a man who has just understood something it's too late to undo. The land was never just dirt. I heard Harold's voice say it as clearly as if that radio in the truck had carried it into the room. He'd said it twice, at the empty fence line, and again the night the prototype worked. Both times I'd half listened. Both times I'd been too busy losing at my own life to hear what he was actually telling me. My mother recovered first, the way people like her always do. "Fine," she said, gripping the table's edge. "Fine. But we have the 1.2 million. That was his gift to Roy. That's settled." Margaret let her finish. Then she drew a single page from the file and laid it flat. "About that," she said. Harold had documented the transfer in his estate plan. Not as a gift. Not as payment for care, because no caregiver agreement had ever been signed. He had recorded it as an advance against Roy's share of the estate. An advance. My mother didn't understand the word yet. I watched it land on her in stages, like a slow tide coming in. Margaret made it plain. The 1.2 million had already been counted. It came off the top of what Roy was set to receive. There was no separate gift. And under the terms Harold had signed, 8 weeks ago, after the porch, after the rain, the remainder allocated to Roy Anderson, after deducting that advance, was. She ran her finger down the page. She turned it around. The number under Roy's name was small. Smaller than Dale's truck payment. Then Margaret picked up the cream envelope, the one I had found in the nightstand drawer, and set back exactly where it had been, and she read from it. Harold's own words. Because he had asked her to read them exactly. "To the ones who got the check. I hope it spends well. I gave it to you on purpose. I wanted to see what a man does when he thinks the money is already his and the old man is just wait. Now I know." My mother's face went still. "To Faye, you didn't open the envelope. I watched you put it back. You never asked what was in it for you. Not once. Not on the worst night. And that is the only reading of a person I have ever trusted." Margaret paused. The rain hit the window hard. "The land was never just dirt, kid. Neither were you. Take care of it like you took care of me." I didn't cry. I had promised myself I wouldn't do that in front of them. I put my hand flat on the accordion file, on the word "land" in his pencil, and I left it there. Then my mother detonated. She came up out of her chair with both hands on the table. Her voice climbed. She manipulated him. A sick, confused old man. 8 weeks before he died. She got in his ear. She turned him. "This is undue influence, and I will contest every word of it." Margaret didn't blink. The video record of Harold's capacity assessment is in the file. 2 physicians. He was found fully competent. You're welcome to contest. My mother turned on me. "After everything I gave up for this family. 30 years. And you steal it out from under us with a soldering iron and a sob story." Her face was wet. But it wasn't grief. It was rage wearing grief's clothes. And everyone in that room could finally see the difference. Dale had his head in his hands doing math that wasn't coming out right. Carol had gone very still and was looking at my mother the way you look at someone when you're seeing them clearly for the first time in 30 years. And my father. Roy made a sound. A small, cracked sound. He was staring at the letter in Margaret's hand, his eyes red, his mouth moving. One word came out. "Dad." Just that. For 1 second I thought he might stand. Might say the true thing. Might break the right way. He looked at me. I looked back. And then my mother said his name, sharp and fast as a slap. And Roy closed his mouth. And lowered his eyes to the carpet. And stayed exactly where he had been for 30 years. Take care of me. Harold had only ever asked one thing of one person. And it wasn't the one with the check. I stood up. Not because I had a speech ready. I didn't. I stood because I was the calmest thing in that loud room, and I wanted to keep it that way. My mother was still talking, Something about lawyers, something about how this wasn't over. I waited until she ran down. Then I said the only thing I had. I'm not going to fight you. I'm not going to contest or argue or post anything. Grandpa already said everything in writing. I'm just going to do what he asked. She stared at me, waiting for the attack that would let her be the victim. I didn't give it to her. You had a contract you never signed, I said. I had a man I never sent back. That's the whole difference. It's the only difference there ever was. I picked up the accordion file and the brass key and I nodded to Margaret, who nodded back. I stopped at the door. Because there was one more true thing, and it cost me nothing to say it. He washed his own mug the night he died, I said, to the room, to my father most of all. So you wouldn't have to. Then I walked out into the hallway. Behind me, I heard my mother's voice rise again and break against the silence of everyone who used to believe her without question. I kept walking. Out past the toner smell, into the rain. Here's what happened after. Because catharsis is easy and consequences are real. My parents kept their $1.2 million. Already spent down considerably. A new BIC, a kitchen remodel. The down payment on a house flip that had gone wrong. But the advance clause meant nothing more was coming. And the $20 million they had assumed was theirs by blood had never existed in their hands at all. They didn't contest. Margaret made a quiet call about the capacity assessments and the fight went out of it before it started. Dale had to face his debt alone. No windfall coming to bail him out. The cousins who had nodded along at the funeral went quiet. Aunt Carol called me a month later. The first thing she said was, "I'm sorry, Faye." I believed her. It was easier to believe her. The version of my mother that had run the family for 30 years, devoted, deprived, devastated, didn't survive that conference room. People had watched her stand over her dead father's words and call her own daughter a thief. You can't take that back with charcoal gray and sunglasses. She'd said on a rain-soaked porch, "He's not our problem anymore." She was right, in the end. Just not the way she'd meant it. None of them were my problem anymore. I was the one with the file labeled the land and the brass key and a letter I'll keep until they put me in the ground. I'd love to tell you I felt triumphant. I didn't. I drove home in the storm with his radio reading out the all clear as the cells moved east. I sat in the parking lot until the rain passed. And I felt the specific quiet grief of having won something I would have traded back, without a second thought, for one more bad cup of coffee with a stubborn old man who washed his dishes by hand. It's been a year now. I did what he asked. The trust funded the thing we started together at my kitchen table. The cheap soil and storm sensor, redesigned around his ridiculous weather radio. The one that pulls storm data from the public band so a farmer doesn't have to pay for the sky. We sell it now. At a price a real farm can afford. Which was always his entire point. Good tools earn their keep. The fund Harold wrote into the will, I run that too. It's small and specific. It helps families who can't afford care keep an aging parent at home instead of on a porch in the rain. We call it the Harold Fund. No plaque. No gala. Just rent covered and prescriptions filled for people the check-clearing kind of family decided were a problem. His radio sits on my workbench. Still on. Still murmuring weather to a room that mostly ignores it. The chipped blue mug holds my pens. The brass key hangs on a nail by the door. Some mornings I touch it on my way out. The way he used to turn it over in his fingers. Key still opens something worth opening. He was right. It opened a lockbox and a number and the truth. But mostly it opened the part of me that had stopped believing showing up for someone counts for anything. A check can clear in a single second. And people will tell you that settles the account. But keeping a promise takes the rest of your life. And in the end, that's the only ledger anyone reads out loud in a room that goes completely silent. He sold everything he had. He handed it over on 3 words and a handshake. And then, when the people holding the money put him out in the rain, he went and did the one thing they never thought to do. He put it in writing. That's my story. One stormy night. One sentence. Take care of me. And a will that finally, quietly, set everything back where it belonged. If this reminded you that love is something you do, not something you wire, take it as your sign today. Call the person who once showed up for you while you still can. Get things in writing. And don't wait for a storm to tell someone they matter. By the way, where are you watching this from? Leave it in the comments, because it's genuinely amazing to see how far these stories travel around the world. If someone you know needed to hear this today, share it with them. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And I'll see you in the next one.